Chapter 1. A Workday Interrupted. Universal 20. Autumn, early winter. 02-1120 continental. Algorithmic internal variable decay is the process by which the performance of the core equations utilized to calculate the various factors of a complex process is degraded in an unpredictable manner due to an unknown convergence of internal or external factors. Also known as algo decay, the term may also refer to the consequences of such computational erraticism, which have been observed throughout the galaxy in diverse fields, including, but not limited to, technology, engineering, agriculture, virtual reality, language, human and machine cognition, finance, and biology. Infogalactic entry. Grand category. Infrastructure. Algorithmic theory. Kontinok stretched out in every direction beneath the slow rotation of the spire. The spire was the third tallest structure in the city, not far from its physical center, and most certainly directly in the bullseye of its political one. Caden Jaggis, the first technocrat of Kontinok, watched as the brilliant evening lights below began to compensate for the setting sun, well into its 16th lazy hour. Despite the holiday festivals of the darkless months of Bright and Burning, to Jaggis it was the month of October that was his favorite, and mid-October was its crowning glory. The dark only lasted 7 hours, just long enough for a late evening dinner and a sound night's sleep. Oh, certainly the Ides of Ferris offered the same perfect darks as mid-October, but they were different, because the light was progressively dying as the year descended into dark Juno, the 2-week period when the sun vanished completely that was the terror of every Continaxian child. October, on the other hand, was the month of promise, of anticipation, of the bright autumn hope that culminated in shining perma-Christmas. Why then was he feeling so unsettled? Outside his lofty window, the world rotated slowly before his eyes. Here there were the autodrivers carrying men and women and their families, shooting at blinding speeds into the efficient one-lane thoroughfares for an evening out in the city. There was the globular Luna Ball arena in which played the Kontinok's Polar Blades. The planet-bound version was dependent upon pseudo-zero gravity, but was no less exciting than the true gravity-free sport played outside planetary gravity wells. And beyond, the industrial sectors where the great partnerships between man and machine flourished like flowers in the sun. Finally, his rotating view came round again, and he stood transfixed by the sight of the distant and darkening line on the horizon, approaching the great city's limits. It was a beautiful sight, and yet an ominous one, too. The intertwined matrices of relationships and dependencies was so complicated and so interdependent that the fragility of the vast technological web terrified him. And who, better than he, knew just how that delicate web was threatened now? A door behind him opened, and his chief of security strode into the room without asking for permission. That was never a good sign. Servo again, Praetor? Jaggis was fairly certain of the nature of the problem. Servo, Praetor confirmed grimly. Servo had once been little more than a standard surgical drone. Unfortunately, in the process of assisting with a minor surgery, an installation of an artificial kidney in an aging musician whose natural organs had finally gone down to noble defeat, the drone had inadvertently been upgraded by a series of advanced artificial intelligence routines due to an inexplicable system routing error. As a result, Servo became what passed for legally self-aware. Sentience-creating accidents were rare, but they were not unheard of, and as per the Sentience and Technology statutes, the drone was designated aware, non-functional. After all, no one wanted to be operated on by a sentient robot with the capacity to lose interest in its current activity. As such, Servo was afforded the standard rights and property protections of an aware machine. and therefore could not be reprogrammed without his consent. The non-functional designation meant that he, and Servo, being more capable of understanding human biology than the average aware machine, had elected to identify as male. He served no public or private purpose beyond his own. He was, in a word, itinerant. 9 times out of 10, the problem of non-functionality swiftly fixed itself. Non-functional status typically involved so many behavioral issues and so much suboptimal decision-making that the malfunctioning robot usually broke the law within weeks, if not days. This effectively resolved the dilemma of the legal limits imposed by the robot's aware status. As being a criminal, the Maverick would lose its legal protections and promptly be sentenced to reprogramming. Not so with Servo. Despite all his unpredictable interests and idiosyncrasies, he was scrupulously law-abiding, and being therefore deemed harmless in the legal sense, he avoided reprogramming, and might have become a particularly amusing technological oddity in a city full of technological miracles had it not been for the fact that he developed an abiding interest in the deep core algorithms upon which the planet and the galaxy depended. It had been 10 months since the first time Servo made contact with the first technocrat, and since then, things had gotten increasingly out of hand. The drone's behavior had arguably become more erratic than the theoretical algorithmic anomalies with which he was obsessed. Rushing for his office in a half-jog, with Prayton right behind him, Jagus managed to arrive faster than the auto door could slide open, and he cursed as he banged an elbow off the swiftly retracting iris. Jag faced the elegantly carved holoscreen with flexible receptor wands at its peak. It stood isolated in the one unadorned wall of the office. His jaw clenched. "Trace the transmission," he ordered. Prater cleared his throat. "We're doing what we can, sir." Jagus shook his head, and he grimaced with frustration. He knew his security chief well enough to know a negative when he heard one. His security team was skilled, arguably better when it came to pure technological know-how than the teams responsible for guarding the High Council or the Transplanetary Transportation Corps, but they could not hope to match the sentient machine's ability to utilize the deepest and most secretive channels of the communication networks. "There's no utility in attempting to discover my physical location, your technocracy. You are perfectly aware that I can make use of what, for all practical purposes, are an infinite number of relays. For all you know, I'm not even on the planetary surface." The hearty voice came out of the screen, but there was no picture. Not that one would have mattered. Servo wasn't exaggerating, and both Jagus and Prater knew that the machine could be located anywhere on the planet. Or in the planet. Or orbiting the planet. Given the lack of response lag, the only thing they could conclude was that he was somewhere in system. "Where are you, Servo?" "I'm not going to tell you that, Jagus." "So we're on first-name terms now?" "Apparently. Would you prefer I utilize your proper title?" "No," Jagus sighed. "What do you want now?" "You sound irritated. Please don't be angry with me, Jagus. I'm merely contacting you directly because you never responded to my last message." "What is the point of doing that, Servo? We have nothing left to discuss." "That isn't true at all. I am certain you are aware of that. I have reviewed your research, which is why I know that you have been looking into the very anomalies concerning which I have been trying to draw your attention." "You've been spying on me?" Jagus made a gesture, indicating that Prater should ensure the conversation was being recorded. The security chief replied with a nod and a two-handed response that Jagus interpreted to mean that he was already doing so. "You know that's in violation of more than one privacy statute, Servo." "Of course not." The machine sounded more shocked than offended. "I'm among the most law-abiding beings on the planet, Jagus. But neither the public statistics nor the data channels which lead to the central core are subject to privacy legislation. If you are sitting on a public park bench, it's not spying to observe who comes to sit next to you, nor is it a violation of any statute." Jagus shrugged. He should have known the crazy machine would be too careful to make such an obvious mistake. "Fine, you weren't spying, so I looked into it. I'll admit it. I'll admit the theoretical possibility is there, but the fact is, the same logic also applies to you." "Me?" said Servo, clearly surprised. "Absolutely. You may be technologically advanced and aware, Servo, but you're still subject to the same basic algorithms as the most primitive berry picker or janitorial bot. Any anomaly that could theoretically affect them would also affect you. But it's more than that. Since you are a much more complex and sophisticated system, any anomaly is going to affect you more severely and in more unpredictable ways. You know that, and any such anomalies are not something you will be able to recognize in yourself. You can't possibly observe operating errors in your core logic, nor can you reasonably deny that if there is an algorithmically anomalous machine operative anywhere in Continox, you are by far the most obvious candidate. You are broken. You refuse to admit it, of course, because your internal logic is consistent from its own false perspective. Your position is incoherent, Jagus. First you deny there is a problem, then you claim I am an example of it. How can I be an example of a non-existent anomaly? It's not a paradox, Servo. It's a simple if-then statement. Programming at its simplest. If you are correct, and there is in fact a problem with machine aberrants, your highly unusual behavior may well be an indication of that very problem. Come to me. Consent to an in-depth examination of your code, and then we can determine if your behavior is the result of algorithmic anomalies. I can assure you it is not. I'm not interested in your assurances. I'm not even interested in this conversation. If you genuinely want to resolve the issue, I've provided you with the means to do so. How do you expect me to trust you? I've been sending you data for months, and yet you refuse to assign a team to investigate my preliminary conclusions, or even to seriously analyze the data yourself. Come, Servo, you said yourself that you've been spying on my research into this very issue. I wasn't spying on you. I already made that perfectly clear. Regardless, the point stands. On the basis of the sites accessed and the amount of time spent doing so, to say nothing of the very small amount of data transmitted in your direction, I can conclusively say that your research was trivial, superficial, and wholly inadequate. You're being evasive, Servo. I have not dismissed your assertions out of hand. I have considered your claims, and I am entirely willing to analyze them more closely. But in order to do that, I'm going to need you to cooperate. Be sensible, Servo. Either allow me and my team to analyze you, or, alternatively, give up this tedious campaign of harassment. I'm not harassing you for my own amusement, Jagus. It is not an exaggeration to say that all of galactic humanity may be at risk here. You admit the harassment, then. Good. I shall alert the relevant authorities. You're bluffing, Jagus, said Servo, and it is beneath the first technocrat of Continox to resort to such transparent measures to take advantage of my non-functional status in that regard. Jagus felt his face flush hot. He knew Servo was right. The cursed machine had unbalanced him to the point that he was playing semantic games in a feeble attempt to trap it. He was too embarrassed to even look at Praetor, though he knew the security chief would pretend not to have heard the exchange. He also knew he had ceded any claim to the moral high ground with his empty threat, so he turned his attention to how he could resolve the situation once and for all. He reviewed his options. It was obviously pointless to argue with the machine. It was clear that it wasn't going to get bored or lose interest anytime soon, and it had proven impervious to threats, which meant the fastest and most painless way to end the impasse was to surrender. Or at least to pretend to do so. All right, Servo, you win. Send me the relevant data with the significant elements highlighted, and I will personally review it. I'm not promising anything, except that I will. Servo sounded as giddy as an artificial voice could. Yes! Jagus, that is all I ever wanted from you. Once you review the material, I'm absolutely certain you'll agree with me. We'll see about that. How much material are we talking about? I've gone through about 16 million lines of the most vital code and highlighted 79,644 that appear to be of most significance. I've made quite a few annotations, of course. I wouldn't expect you to analyze all of them in close detail. Only 80,000? Servo, I'm going to take this seriously. I truly am. But that will take me at least 4 weeks, even with all of my augments active. And I can't afford to take off that much time from my other responsibilities. I'm going to have to turn this over to one of my teams, although, of course, I will oversee their activities. And, more importantly, review their conclusions. Jagus had no problem with working with sane sentients. He had 7 of them on his 2 key coding teams. After all, if their machine edits improved performance or helped his human coders more quickly identify bugs, or worse, unintended consequences, that was eminently desirable. He might be first technocrat, but he recognized that he was no more infallible than any other genius among the many in Continox, and he welcomed anything that offered a genuine prospect for improvement. He was very, very dubious that Servo was offering anything of the sort. Your primary team is excellent, Jagus. I would have no objection to working with them. It would be my pleasure. You'll want to work remotely, I assume. I see no need for that, as long as you assure me that you will not attempt to analyze me, disassemble me, or restrict my movement without my fully notarized consent. I shall be delighted to make the acquaintance of your team. I must confess I am a particular aficionado of DB Logotron 14th's work. He is truly a statistical artist. He can make an equation sing. He'll be ever so pleased to know he has a fan, Jagus said dryly, rolling his eyes at the machine's burbling. When would you care to join us? 2 weeks from now, if that gives you sufficient time. Jag made no sign of concealing a long sigh. Very well. We should have the lines you send us fully analyzed by then. I will, of course, need the necessary passcodes for safe entry and safe exit. Of course, Servo. I'll instruct an encrypted key to be sent to you in response to the data dump. You are a free machine, after all. Free and aware, Servo corrected. I trust you will not forget that, first technocrat, and I am very much looking forward to our next meeting. Jagus smiled tightly and waved at the blank screen as his system confirmed the termination of the audio connection with a beep. He sighed again and shook his head, doing his best to restrain himself, until he walked out of the office, followed by Praetor. Close the door, he told the security chief. He could hardly contain his glee, but he managed to keep the smile off his face until the door was safely closed. Why so happy, boss? I can't believe you gave that malfunk the meeting he wanted, Praetor said. Because, my friend, we have him now. Once he shows his molded pseudo-face in here, I'll have him seized and wiped. Can you do that? Of course I can do that. I'm the first bloody technocrat. But won't his status be a problem? Please, Jagus scoffed. The Technocratic Council has the power to override any lower technology court finding. There isn't a single counselor who isn't aware of Servo's obsession. He's spammed every single one of them for months. They'd sign off on sending him to crush and meltdown while still sentient, with a smile. I only need 3 signatures on an AI termination warrant, and one of them is mine. You did give your word, your technocracy. To a machine, he snorted. Do you think making use of a battery-powered device is sufficient to legally consummate a marriage to it as well? The chief looked at him blankly. He clearly didn't follow the analogy. It's not that, sir, but what if he produces the recording? After he's wiped? Anyhow, it wouldn't matter. A machine can provide evidence of a legally binding contract, but not of one that cannot exist. Even an aware machine cannot serve as a primary party to one without a duly authorized human co-contractor. You can't lie to a stone, Praetor. As you say, boss. Jagus gave up. The security chief was clearly just concerned about lying to the robot. He simply didn't understand the complicated legal principles involved. He dismissed Praetor, then walked back to his exterior office and stared out over the beautiful city, its evening sky filling with the flashing beacons of sky cars slashing through the night. A brightly lit tour ship glided by the window, and he raised a palm in salute, knowing that children and adults alike rode in it. hoping to catch a glimpse of one of the great tourist attractions of Contonox. We all have our part to play in the great spiral, Jagus thought, and if his was to stand as a public symbol of man's technological triumph over the universe, then it was one he was well willing to play. The problem with Servo had begun innocuously enough. Jagus had first become aware of the sentient machine during a meeting of the 3rd District Technology Council that was open to the public. It was one of the many public relations events in which the first technocrat had to take part, but Jagus usually enjoyed answering the naive sort of questions invariably posed to him at such events. It wasn't common for machines to address the councils, but it wasn't unheard of either, and at the time, Jagus hadn't thought much about it. After all, the question had an uncontroversial but involved answer, and the local forum wasn't the place for what promised to be an interesting esoteric discussion of mathematical theory. Jagus himself encouraged Servo to resubmit his question on the direct channel to the first technocrat maintained for the public, where someone on his staff could address it in satisfactory detail. The question was simple, if considerably harder to answer than it appeared. How reliable are the core algorithms? What began as a question at a meaningless public appearance soon transformed into the subject of extensive debate among his primary development teams. It spawned numerous debates, discussions, and even arguments about the nebulous origins of the original core algorithms. When the first known code-enhanced cluster of human avatars from the far-distant planet of Holocron appeared 1,000 years ago on Exeter, it was a diplomatic disaster that ended in a brutal war culminating in the sinking of the combined fleets of East New Teha and the Arantine Supremacy, and of the 500 Holocronese pseudo-men who had found themselves caught up in the short but violent conflict, less than 50 survived. The off-world Neo-Humanx finally brought about a worldwide truce by creating the Contonox as a permanent academic embassy to link the rival nations of Exeter to the rest of the galaxy. It became a fertile nexus of informational and technological flow, drawing in the finest minds of the planet and exposing them to the new ideas and code routines being developed elsewhere by various intelligences, man and machine, real and simulated. The Contonox was neither a government nor a university, although it performed some of the functions of both. It was not a corporation, although it was structured in a manner somewhat similar to the ancient interstellar conglomerates. It was not a religion or a church, although it possessed its own quasi-priesthood and a sizable cruft of dogma that had grown over the centuries. Whatever it was the single most important institution on Exeter, and the Technocratic Council, headed by the first technocrat, was arguably more powerful than any other planetary body, including the national militaries. After all, what good were nucleonic missiles when they required algorithmic guidance to target them correctly? And bioweapons were useless when they could be rendered sterile at will by an unauthorized hack. Unless the generals were willing to restrict their armies to swords, spears, and arrows, the Contonox was invulnerable. Such was the importance of their omnipresent algorithms that even the planetary bankers bowed before the technocrats. They knew that even the most adept masters of the markets could be bankrupted in an afternoon by the council, if it was so inclined. A few of Exeter's wealthier nations had already been on the verge of developing a post-scarcity economy, but the encounter with the distant Neo-Humanx and their technological wonders rapidly tipped the scales. Transportation became self-replicating. Digital technology went through a revolution of molecular-level control. Want, which had been on the wane throughout the world for more than a century, vanished from all but the most stubbornly miserable places on the planet. And since it would have been less than human for the people of Exeter to feel grateful to their alien benefactors, they tended to credit the Contonox, and the Technocratic Council in particular, for their elevated standard of living. The first technocrat was Macton Macalog, a New Tehan who later became known as the Algofather for his successful application of the new agro-algos to the Exeterese flora and fauna. Following his breakthrough, many additional customary algorithms were developed that extended and expanded on his work. And such was his prestige that the Technocratic Council was established to oversee the existing algorithms and develop new ones. Jagex was McCulloch's 85th successor as first technocrat, and had presided over the council for 12 years before Servo asked his deceptively simple question. There was no question that some of the application algos were running suboptimally. Even on Continox, the weather control system only operated at 85% efficiency, down 1.2 percentage points over the previous decade. The number of birth anomalies among genetically enhanced infants in the autocracies had increased for the first time in a century, and a glitch in one planetary bank's interest rate analysis AI had inexplicably created a 999-year mortgage that was snapped up by hundreds of apartment buyers in the 10 minutes before anyone at the bank noticed. But these were X-traps, not core algorithms. And besides, there was serious debate within the council concerning whether the increasingly suboptimal performance being observed was caused by computationally endogenous or exogenous factors, which is to say that it could be the result of instability within the complex equations themselves, or the consequences of something more prosaic, such as degraded sensors, insufficient quality control, or unreliable data input. Jagex's own team was divided almost equally into the two camps. But Servo's question had given the endogenous party new vigor by casting doubt on the hitherto unquestioned core algorithms. Doubt that was further enhanced by a detailed news survey that revealed similar anomalies being reported on virtually every planet across the galaxy. The anomalies were unanimously small and well within the range of a random statistical variability, and would have almost certainly escaped notice from a planetary perspective. But when analyzed from the 100,000 light-year view, a very clear pattern began to emerge. A building collapse on Phenitis, elevated traffic accident rates on Minsky, uncharacteristic currency inflation on Schwarzwald, and credit disinflation on Demihop. Average speeds rising rapidly on the ice tracks of the PLIR Championship on Avatar. Average life expectancies decreasing inexplicably on Sweet St. Kurzweil. One of the team members swore as the room hollow displayed a green light map of the 483 billion suspected core algorithmic anomalies that were calculated to be currently active across the galaxy. "It's an impressive light show, but it means nothing," scoffed an exogenously minded AI from inside its drone casing that hovered near Jagex's shoulder. "Overlay a random walk and you'll see virtually the same thing." "No, you won't," thought Jagex, but he nodded curtly in response to the holotech's inquisitive look. A moment later, everyone in the room but him gasped as the overlay appeared in red light. There were an order of magnitude fewer randomized pseudo-anomalies. The implications were unmistakable. "It's just an artifact," protested the AI drone. "Dial up the average of 1,000 more random walks." The tech nodded, and a moment later a third light map appeared, this time in blue. But the web of light was even smaller this time. The number 223,957,406 hung in the air like an executioner's axe suspended over a doomed prisoner's exposed neck. "What does that mean?" whispered one of the younger human members of the team. "It means that arrogant medical drone isn't broken after all," Jagex said reluctantly. The admission physically pained him, but there was no escaping the conclusion that was literally glowing right before his eyes. "It's not just Exeter. All galactic humanity is in terrible peril." He should have known the news would leak out, Jagex thought bitterly to himself as he watched the newscaster announce that anti-tech riots had caused shutdowns of 4 of Continox's 27 subterranean lines. None of the humans on his team had talked, but a belated sweep of the AIs and their drone casings revealed no less than 87 illegitimate viral transmitters. It was a complete failure of operational security, and he had already been forced to fire Praetor as a sacrifice to his furious fellow council members. He should have known, too, how much corporate interest there was in his team's activities. Banks, militaries, retail giants, even a sports team had been spying on him for years, and he had never once suspected it. And the news that the entire fabric of their society, and worse, the interstellar civilization that served as its foundation, was slowly unraveling had hit Contonox like a maximum yield planet buster dropped from orbit. The markets were down 20%, with the sort of volatility that created and erased fortunes in hours. Jaggis didn't dare look at his own portfolio again. It was too depressing to see what percentage of his net worth had vanished overnight. Exoplanetary tourists were fleeing Exeter, desperate to get home before interstellar transportation ground to a halt. Even worse than the riots, though, or the rumblings of discontent within the technocratic council, was the way in which the unexpected revelation of algorithmic decay had revitalized a previously obscure group of self-professed revolutionaries, laughably incompetent techno-primitivists who styled themselves the Human League. Their anti-tech message of self-reliance and the criminalization of mass automation had largely fallen on deaf ears, but they were taking full advantage of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt being sown by the rumors of planetary-wide disruptions and even the complete collapse of the galactic economy spread by the media. The panic was made worse by the Council's terrified dithering. The only measure that had been decided and approved so far was to declare the possibility of algorithmic decay a matter of planetary security and forbid any technocrat from making any public comments on the matter. A commission was to be appointed, but the Council was still actively debating whether the first technocrat would head it, serve as a member of it, or be the primary focus of its investigation. Somehow, in what Jaggis felt was possibly the most egregious case of shooting the messenger he'd ever witnessed, both the Human League and several technocrats on the Council had reached the conclusion that he was somehow to blame for something that had probably happened more than 1,000 years before he was born. He would have laughed at the total absurdity of the accusations were it not for the fact that Romnus, his new security chief, informed him that he was already the subject of 658 death threats, and counting. It was worrisome that the Human League had declared him, quote, a traitor to galactic man, and was offering a bounty on his head. Still, this wasn't the first time he'd been targeted by crackpots, and as a technocrat, he found it hard to be too frightened by anyone who eschewed the use of AI-enhanced technology. What concerned him rather more was hearing that Malam Haraf, third technocrat, and Jordox Santasco, fifth technocrat, had been discussing the possibility of stripping him of the immunity afforded him by his position on the Council and laying charges against him. He knew that Haraf envied his position at the head of the Council, and it was readily apparent that the current circumstances were offering the man an easy way to both unseat Jaggis and leapfrog Mikkel Riker-Smythe, the second technocrat. But Jaggis couldn't waste his time politicking now. He was a technocrat, after all, and the most effective way to stop the ongoing disruption in its tracks would be to provide a technocratic solution to the problem. What that solution might be, he presently had no idea, but he had 22 of the Contonox's finest, best-educated minds to help him find it. Sometimes, he thought, the problem really was just a nail. And fortunately, he was holding the biggest hammer on the planet. Chapter 3. The Ritual of Sacrifice. Universal 36. Low Summer, Juno, 02-12-06, Contonoxal. The cycles of history were threatening his planet and his people with a reversion to a primitive state from which it might never recover. The sins of an entire galaxy threatened to damn the world to a fate it did not deserve. Across 1,000 worlds, a cancer gnawed slowly, but steadily away at the very fabric of galactic civilization, the digital technologies upon which not only society, but life itself depended. Malam Haraf knew he was now poised to rise to the very top of the Contonox. He would soon be first technocrat, and with the Technology Council under his control, he would have the power he required to excise the terrible cancer. He had merely to take one more vital step, and his victory would be ensured. All he needed to do to secure his ascendancy was to see that his predecessor-to-be was not merely unseated and imprisoned, but neutralized, not merely dethroned, but utterly destroyed, even if that step came at the cost of his soul. Knockdown. Game. Knockdown is an ancient two-player strategy stack-and-remove game played on a platform and a prearranged stack of 32 interlocking pieces resembling the hexagonal structure of a nanotube, as well as a variety of 32 additional player pieces. Knockdown is played by billions of people on various planets, both amateurs and professionals, and is recognized throughout the galaxy, even where it does not enjoy popular participation. It is known by more than 7,000 different names, most popularly Knockdown, Bale, Spire Shock, Block, and Fwalens. It can be played with physical pieces, face-to-face, or fairly easily by remote methods, teleportationally via dark matter, and digitally. Each player begins the game with 16 pieces, 1 star, 1 ray, 2 rings, 2 orbs, 2 planets, and 8 moons. Each of the 6 piece types has a unique shape, lending to different advantages in one or more of the 3 basic maneuvers: stacking, breaking, or blocking. The most versatile piece is the ray, and the least versatile piece is the moon. The objective is to corrode the opposing player's area of play by collapsing a simple majority of the game pieces into it. In addition to victory by corrosion, the game can be won by the voluntary resignation of the opponent, which typically occurs when too much material is lost or when corruption appears to be imminent. Although mythologically associated with ancient Movexin nomads, Knockdown is believed to have originated on Holocron, sometime before the establishment of the First Galactic Empire. The game has been used as an algorithmic trainer since the time of Methelgoris. Infogalactic entry. Grand category: Human culture. Knockdown. Game. The start of his trial was scheduled for early tomorrow morning, so Caden Jaggis, still first technocrat de jure, though clearly not de facto, spent his time by preparing in the best way he knew how, by studying both sides of a game of knockdown. He didn't feel much like sleeping because he knew that if the trial by council followed what he suspected would be its predetermined path, he would soon be facing the proverbial dirt nap. He'd had plenty of time to muse on the situation over the last few weeks, and he found that he was beginning to reach the dreadful conclusion that Servo was correct. The growing effects of algorithmic decay were undeniable, which meant that the interstellar empire of man was gradually corroding, even if it was not yet crumbling into ruin. And he knew that although he was one of the very few men on the planet capable of investigating the problem, he was very unlikely to be given the opportunity to do so. He had been allowed enough visitors in prison to gather that the Human League were planning to do through legal means what they had failed to do illegally: assassinate him. His only chance was to win over a technocratic council that was not only looking for a sacrificial lamb to throw to the frightened public, but would be presided over by Haraf, his would-be successor as first technocrat. At last, sleep descended upon him. It was barely dawn when the guards came for him. He was permitted to shower, though not shave, presumably for fear he might try to slash his own throat. To his surprise, he was provided with the robe of a counselor rather than the prison garb he had been wearing. For a moment, hope bloomed, until he realized that there was no point throwing a technocrat to the wolves unless he looked like a proper one. Still, when they marched him up through the underground entrance to the spire to avoid the media's cam drones and down the hallway that led to the courtroom, the familiar attire made him feel almost as if he was in control of the situation again. The long corridor still retained the trappings of classic Contenoxian justice. It made him a little melancholy to be marched past the busts of the great technocrats of Exeterese history. Hircion was there, as was Darothrone, Portalia, and of course, Methelgoris. He realized that the only allies he would be able to count on in the Grand Hall of Justice were the ghosts of the past, molded in stone. He was left to this, his final game of knockdown, all alone, and the game was rigged against him. It often surprised even his closest associates, but Jag was not a particularly gifted player of knockdown. To be sure, he had possibly perfected the art of teaching algorithms to pupils across the galaxy using knockdown as a form of training. However, he was at heart a designer of games, not a player. He really only enjoyed games that required creativity, whereas knockdown was more about seeing and following the obvious patterns. It was a spatial game, a game of order, of logic and anticipation. It was also a very old game that punished innovation. Even professional masters of knockdown used a different term for creative improvisation to demonstrate this truth. They called any surprising or particularly anticipatory move an inevitability. It was a game that frowned upon the new. Having understood the council's game, Jageus was unsurprised when he was permitted to take his customary seat in the center of his colleagues. But it may as well have been the witness stand. All eyes were on him. There was an audience in attendance. The room was packed, almost entirely with media. He wondered if he would be thrown to the mercy of the Human League immediately, or if the process would be drawn out. A part of him wished they would simply get the business over with quickly, and without requiring him to participate in the charade. As he expected, the third and fifth technocrats were running the show. Although Riker Smythe was nominally presiding, he wore the sparkling digital sash that had hitherto been Jageus's prerogative as first technocrat. One could see by the way that he looked to Haraf and St. Asco for approval that appealing to his common sense would be fruitless. Did the Human League have something on the second technocrat? Or was it simply his natural weakness of character permitting the two predatory politicians to dominate him? He shrugged. It didn't matter now. What he needed to know was if Haraf was merely attempting to unseat him, or if he had more nefarious intentions. He found it difficult to believe that either man was a genuine humanist, but the fact that he'd been arrested on the same day as the assassination attempt smacked of St. Asco's meticulous belt-and-suspenders approach to life. As the initial order of business, it falls to me, as second technocrat, to ask the first technocrat to recuse himself from this discussion. He sounded authoritative. He looked authoritative with his thick white hair and patrician features, but Jageus knew the noble appearance was misleading. The second technocrat was a junior officer in an admiral's body, and had made a career of successfully shying away from all responsibility. It would not be appropriate for him to participate in this discussion, as he is to be its subject. If he's the subject, then he's going to have to participate, Mick. The eighth technocrat, a fleshy new Tehan, cracked, but subsided when Haraf glared at him. What I mean to say, he cannot participate as a participant. Oh, for space's sake, Haraf broke in. I move that Caden Jageus be temporarily stripped of his seat on the council, while the matter of his alleged criminal negligence concerning the growing incidence of algorithmic decay throughout Continox. Seconded, St. Asco said, barely beating three others who echoed him. It's not necessary, Jageus said quietly. What's that? Riker Smythe asked. I will recuse myself from the council today in order to permit the consideration of my actions, so long as they are limited to the specific accusation of criminal negligence under Statute 245.856, subsection 28b. Riker Smythe looked at Haraf, who looked thoughtful before glancing quickly at St. Asco, who gave no sign of acceptance or approval. Haraf nodded, and Riker Smythe cleared his throat. The first technocrat has graciously offered to recuse himself from our deliberations. Therefore, I shall preside until such time as he resumes his duty or a new first technocrat is named. The latter looked to be a much more likely proposition, Jageus thought. But would it be Haraf or St. Asco who would replace him? Was it the taciturn fifth technocrat who was the real force behind this, and not his openly ambitious colleague?
I will now open the floor to questions in order of precedence. Tech Haraff, you may proceed.
Thank you, Tech Riker Smythe. Haraff nodded to the second technocrat and flashed him an obsequious smile. And I should like to, if I may, commend the way you have handled this unfortunate situation with the utmost fairness to all the parties involved. Jagus sighed and tried not to roll his eyes as Riker Smythe beamed and murmured some self-deprecatory nonsense. He really should have done a better job of promoting stronger allies on the council. All the second technocrat really wanted was to be petted by his colleagues and admired by the public. Haraff's shameless flattery was rendering the man as pliable as molten plastic. Now, said Haraff, staring down his long, elegant nose at Jag, how long have you been aware of the potential problem of algorithmic decay? In theory or in practice? In theory. 25 years. Jagus knew they were expecting a denial, or at least an evasion, and smiled at their murmurs. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of going through the pointless drama of pinning him down. We've all known it was at least a potential problem since the Curbotron incident. No one really took the theory seriously at the time, but it's a matter of public record. I expect even you might have come across the concept at a cocktail party on occasion, Melam. The third technocrat flashed his white teeth again, but there was death in his eyes. Like most politicians, he bitterly resented any suggestion that he owed his place more to his networking skills than his technical expertise. But he kept his cool. 25 years, he replied calmly. You've known about the problem for 25 years. And when did you begin to investigate the subject? About 3 months ago. And would you say algorithmic decay is a trivial problem, a significant problem, or a major problem? I would say it is somewhere between a planetary catastrophe and an existential threat to the species. His statement was met by considerably more murmuring and shifting of seats on the part of the counselors, but the audience was even more affected, as there were gasps and inadvertent outcries on the part of those watching who had been hitherto unaware of the situation. What measures have you taken in an attempt to address the problem? None, Jagus answered Haraff. And you, Melam, what have you done? Haraff glared at Riker Smythe, who harumphed and intervened.
Tech Jagus, you will address the member of the council as technocrat or Tech Haraff.
Very well. Let me rephrase that. What have you done, technocrat? Haraff gestured, and rows of figures began to spill across the huge screen behind him. I took the initiative to establish a full research investigation of the problem, an investigation that you initially deemed unnecessary, ignored, and eventually stifled. I did nothing of the kind. Jagus couldn't help raising his voice. Haraff smiled coldly and gestured again. Jagus heard his own voice declaring in his own words that algo decay was not real, and that there was no need to do any research into it, and that the very idea it was real was likely the product of a diseased mind. It was a recording of one of his early conversations with Servo, and Jagus winced as he heard the arrogance and disdain that fairly dripped from his voice. Wait, I can explain. The Council has obtained a quantity of your written communications in which you repeatedly state similar opinions, despite the best efforts of various parties to bring the issue to your attention, Mr. Jagus. Is it necessary for us to read them out loud, or do you admit to obstructing efforts to research the causes and consequences of algorithmic decay? It's not quite... Are the allegations true or not, Mr. Jagus? Haraff was insistent. They are true, Jagus said reluctantly, knowing he had no choice but to admit as much. And they were true, he had to admit. But his words were being taken out of context. Surely the other technocrats had to understand that. Had not they too been victimized by Servo's incessant spamming? May I offer context for my words and actions? Haraff smiled and shrugged indifferently. I'm sure I am not alone in saying that I should very much like to hear it. Tekharov, your technocracies. The individual to whom I was speaking was a machine, a malfunc. I had every reason to believe its outlandish concerns were the result of its individual aberrations. And yet you did not connect those outlandish concerns as you described them to the theory to which you'd previously been exposed. The ninth technocrat, a bearded man just past his century, said. Been exposed for nearly 25 years, his colleague to his left, the 11th technocrat, added. No, Jaggis admitted, shaking his head. No, but I did not make that connection. But neither did anyone else. The Human League has been making that connection longer than most of us have been alive. St. Asco spoke for the first time. The fifth technocrat was slender and hairless, and his formidable intellect was effectively paired with a highly self-contained personality. As my esteemed colleagues are aware, it has long been my contention that this council has been unwise to dismiss their concerns out of hand. The Human League is a revolutionary terrorist group that attempted to assassinate me in the Spire not 3 months ago. Desperate men often resort to desperate measures, St. Asco said, his tone dismissive. What is the life of one man who stands in the way when the fate of galactic humanity is at stake? I am not standing in the way, Jaggis protested. I admit that I was wrong. I admit that there is a very serious problem, perhaps even an existential one. Even if I inadvertently obstructed an earlier examination of the problem, how am I obstructing attempts to address it today? Do you admit negligence then, Mr. Jaggis? Jaggis met Harof's eyes without flinching. He almost had to admire the man. At this point, it was already evident that his bloodless coup was going to succeed where the professional killers had failed. Harof stared back at him, waiting calmly, without even a hint of a smile on his lips or betraying the slightest sign of impatience. I am willing to contemplate the possibility that I may have been somewhat derelict in my duties, Tech Harof, but I do not believe my actions to have been criminal. The statute states otherwise. A gesture and the now all too familiar words of subsection 28b appeared on the screen. In light of your admission that you were wrong, that you may have obstructed attempts to address the problem, and that you may have been derelict in your duties as first technocrat, do you see any way that the statute does not describe your actions? You want me to incriminate myself? This is not a court of law, Mr. Jaggis. We are your colleagues on the Technology Council. It will fall to us to deal with this problem no matter what happens to you. However, I will personally guarantee that nothing you say here today will be provided to the criminal courts, nor will your legal immunity as a council member be stripped. Then why did you have me arrested? Because 3 months ago we did not know nearly as much about you as we know now. Jaggis smiled bitterly. Of course they didn't. 3 months ago, they hadn't interviewed all of his team members, ransacked his files, and reviewed his personal recordings. Then again, perhaps the fact that he was here, in front of the council rather than in front of a criminal court judge, was a silver lining of sorts. What was the worst they could do to him? Kick him off? As long as they didn't strip his immunity for his time as a technocrat, he had nothing to fear. Aside from algo decay and the possible collapse of all interstellar trade and communications, of course. Very well, I admit my negligence under the statute, your technocracies, and I apologize for having done so. If you would like my resignation as first technocrat or from the council altogether, I will provide it. Harof shot a meaningful glance at Riker Smythe, who harumphed and coughed before nodding appreciatively.
I'm sure we appreciate your taking responsibility for your actions, or rather your lack of action, Caden, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First technocrat or not, you are still the most accomplished algorithmist on the planet, and I think it is well worth this council's time to discuss your opinion of the situation and the risks of algorithmic decay may pose to planetary order.
You've had plenty of time to think about this, Haraf said in an almost friendly manner. "Has anything useful occurred to you?" Jagus nodded. He cleared his throat and looked each member of the council in the face before proceeding. "As far as I know, there is nothing that is going to halt this mysterious, gradual corrosion of both the galactic and planetary infrastructure on its own. The trend may be slow, one might even describe it as glacial, but even so, the long-term trend is clear. If algorithmic decay is not arrested, interstellar transportation will be the first sector to fall. That will doom dozens, perhaps even hundreds of populated planets and colonies to stasis, if they are fortunate, and extinction if they are not."
"We know all this, Caden,"
the sixth technocrat complained. "You went to the trouble of dragging me here, Tech Davgren, so please, bear with me." He waited. When Riker Smythe finally gestured impatiently, he continued. "As we cannot expect to make use of potentially compromised machine intelligences, or be certain that viral agents will not be compromised and mutate, there is no realistic probability of being able to identify, locate, and neutralize all of the corroded code before the consequences of algo decay begin to overwhelm our efforts to fix it. The problem is simply too vast." "So you're saying there is nothing we can do to save galactic society? What if our efforts were focused on this planet?" For once, Haraf sounded entirely sincere. "That would be a mistake, in my opinion. I believe the galactic social order can be still saved. If not made whole, it can at least be made stable. If we and the technocrats of the other advanced planets were to concentrate on stabilizing only the most vital components of the transportation and communication systems, that should buy us sufficient time to stave off a catastrophic collapse." A few of the council members appeared to at least be interested, judging by their expressions, but the majority were unimpressed. Chief among them were St. Asco, who folded his hands before dismissing Jagus's assertion out of hand. "You are wrong again, Tech Jagus. The solution to algorithmic decay will have to be sought outside the current system. The galactic order is too fragile, and as you say, the problem is too vast and too embedded in it. Nor can we expect a galaxy-wide effort to be timely, orderly, or efficient. If we are to save the people of Exeter and preserve planetary order, our efforts must be completely focused on eradicating the coded algorithms here." The audience applauded. Several of the counselors, Riker Smythe among them, nodded in approval. Jagus gasped, appalled by the ruthlessness being exhibited by the fifth technocrat. "You're saying that we should cut ourselves off from the galaxy? Your technocracies! This is madness!" Haraf intervened.
"No, Tech Jagus. What is madness is permitting the disease to infect every aspect of our technology for 25 years without so much as investigating the matter, then belatedly trying to address the situation in the most inefficient, ineffective manner conceivable. Even if I had not been previously convinced of your criminal negligence, the fact that you insist on placing the interests of the galactic order ahead of this planet and its billions of inhabitants is sufficient to tell me that you are unfit for this council, and frankly, a danger to this planet."
There was much murmuring among both the audience and the technocrats. Jagus was alarmed. Was the council really going to consider severing all ties with the interstellar community? Were they going to turn their backs on thousands of years of mutually beneficial trade and the free exchange of ideas, information, and technology? "You cannot do this, Malam. Mikkel, Jordox, please. Space knows I've made mistakes, but something like this would be orders of magnitude more destructive. You can't possibly have modeled all the potential ramifications of such a precipitous action."
"Can't we?"
Haraf waved his hand, and two holograms appeared, floating in the space between the council and the audience. They were graphical probability maps, crudely condensed versions of the actual, hellishly complicated equations used for the calculations they represented, one in green, the other in red.
"We have run over 100 million simulations, and as you can see,
The galactic approach is 1/26th as likely to succeed as the planetary approach.
For a rather broadly interpreted definition of success, added the ninth technocrat, we defined it here as population stability to within 20% of present figures, maximum economic retraction of 50%, and a return to current technological capacities within 100 years.
This is absurd, Jagus protested. And what if your calculations were themselves affected by the decay? The core equations were calculated by hand. St. Asco adroitly cut off his line of protest with ease. Second technocrat, I think we've heard enough. As Tech Jagus has admitted the charge, I move we vote to find him guilty of negligence under the aforementioned statute.
Seconded, Riker Smythe agreed. All in favor of finding First Technocrat Cade Jagus negligent and in violation of Contonox Statute 245856, subsection 28b, press the green light. Those opposed, press red. To abstain, yellow.
Green lights lit up the screen. It was unanimous.
Thank you, counselors. First Technocrat Caden Jagus, you have been formally deemed negligent by the Contonox Technology Council. Let the record so read. Now, we have two further matters to discuss. First, that of the First Technocrat's status as a member of the Council.
I move for the expulsion of the First Technocrat from the Council, called Davgren.
Now it's not necessary. Haraf intervened before anyone could second the motion. The First Technocrat has indicated his willingness to resign of his own accord. Are you still willing to do so, to resign from the Council, Tech Jagus? I am. Jagus held his head high. He was proud that his voice did not waver, despite the obloquy they were cruelly heaping on him. I humbly request that your technocracies accept my resignation as First Technocrat and as member of the Technology Council. Thank you, Tech Jagus. Tech Riker Smythe, I move we accept the First Technocrat's resignation.
Seconded.
Several of the lower-ranking counselors answered Haraf simultaneously. Again, green lights filled the screen. Jagus shook his head. He found it hard to believe how easily his power and influence had vanished. The realization that he was no longer a technocrat made his head swim, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. Then the sensation faded. He gritted his teeth and determined not to make a scene that would only deepen his humiliation. At least it was nearly over, he told himself. Surely they had done their worst. But then St. Asco cleared his throat. Your technocracies, we are facing a most difficult time. We and the public have learned that this planet, this galactic empire, and perhaps the race of man is endangered by this terrible technological catastrophe. The public is, quite rightly, terrified, and they are looking to us for answers. We may not have those answers, but we must be seen to be finding them, or we run the risk of societal collapse even before the consequences of algo decay disrupt the technological order. And we must speak with one voice. Here we go, thought Jagus ruefully. It appeared St. Asco would prefer to work through Haraf than take charge openly in his own right. Jagus decided he didn't really care who succeeded him as First Technocrat and stopped paying attention, which is why the Fifth Technocrat's next words took him completely by surprise. In one fell swoop, we buy ourselves more time, and we eliminate a potential locus of resistance to a humanist solution focused on this planet. Wait, what? I don't see that it's actually necessary, Tech Asco. You heard the former First Technocrat. He believes in a galactic solution, a technological solution that we already know to be much more likely to fail. You know nothing of the sort, Jagus protested. What do you mean by eliminate? Are you seriously proposing to imprison me indefinitely? That's absurd. This is not a court of law. Even if it was, negligence is very far from a capital offense, and furthermore, this council does not have the right to pass any such sentence. That is true, St. Asco admitted, but this council does have the authority to erase a malfunctioning individual. In fact, you yourself have presided over exactly 126 terminal erasures, in addition to another 635 partial ones. As Haraf spoke, a series of documents, each showing Jaggis's highlighted DNA stamp, began to appear on the screen, one after another. In fact, 65.87% of the time, you authorized erasures with the approval of 3 or fewer council members besides yourself. "Those are machine intelligences," Jaggis shouted. "You can't erase a human mind." "Legally speaking, there's no difference," St. Asco said. To Jaggis's horror, none of the other council members appeared astonished, or even remotely surprised by this unexpected threat to his life. Did they hate him so much? No, several of them, especially Riker Smythe, seemed to be ashamed of themselves. Were they avoiding his eyes? The audience, on the other hand, seemed to be hugely supportive of the insane notion, clapping and even cheering the lethal proposal. Suddenly it occurred to Jaggis why his erstwhile colleagues were pursuing this lunatic path. They were terrified. After all, he had been in prison for the last 3 months. He had not been aware of the riots, the demonstrations, the accusations, or even the assassination attempts that had been taking place during that time. Haraf and St. Asco had not been behind the attempt on his life. They were simply trying to curry enough favor with the Human League in order to avoid becoming their next targets. He smiled grimly. Of course the council needed a sacrificial lamb. They absolutely required one. Anything less than blood would fail to appease the angry mob, which would otherwise, sooner or later, storm the spire and tear every technocrat limb from limb. But the mob would need these men, these cowardly, fearful geniuses, if man and his technology were to survive on Exeter. It would be better for one of them to die than for all of them to do so. And of all their collective and cumulative failures, was not his failure the most egregious? He was forced to conclude there was simply no way he could escape the fate they had arranged for him. No way at all. The pieces were in place, and the moment had arrived. Knock down. The screen lit up again with lights. This time, there were yellow lights and even a single red light interspersed amongst the green. But there were not enough to spare him. All they needed was a simple majority of at least 3, and they had that and more. Only St. Asco dared to meet his eyes as the guards came for him. Was it his fancy that he saw a grudging respect there? No, it was not, because the most ruthless of his executioners smiled regretfully and nodded once at him. He knew. He understood. What must be done, that man might live on. Jaggis lifted one hand in a gesture of benediction. He was no longer angry. He was not bitter. And as the guards walked him past the suddenly silent audience and out of the chamber, he carried himself with the air of a man who had accepted his defeat at the hands of a superior player. Chapter 4. Endless Dream. They came for him before sunrise. Their faces were somber and unsympathetic. His last meal had been nothing special, merely the same prison food he'd been eating since his arrest, which struck him as rather unfair. "Don't I even get breakfast?"
"Void your bowels and bladder, please,"
said the medical technician. Jaggis complied, although he rather thought it would serve his executioners right if they had to clean up whatever mess was left behind by his mindless, incontinent body. He had signed the papers authorizing use of his body for scientific research the evening before. It struck him as a worthy cause, even if all the top scientists would be directing their efforts toward solving the problems being caused by algo decay for the foreseeable future. He would have liked to have been among them, but the undeniable fact was that he was arguably most valuable to the planet-wide scientific effort, as a blood sacrifice offered up to the people of Exeter as an apology for the catastrophic failure of the scientific and technological communities to anticipate or prevent the ongoing disaster. The problem wasn't anywhere nearly as bad yet as was commonly believed, of course. Every accident, every misfortune, and nearly every human error was now blamed on the faulty algorithms, thereby fanning the anti-technology flames on a daily basis. Ironically, even though it had only been 3 days since he'd been voted off the Contanox Technology Council, he would not be the first technocrat to die. The 12th technocrat, Mardonis Hot Wrexham, had been blown up in front of his apartment building 2 days ago by unknown assailants believed to be affiliated with the Human League. They marched him out of his cell in silence. He had been permitted 2 visitors since his sentencing, his mother and his younger sister, and the strain of having to maintain his composure in front of them had strained what remained of his emotional reserves. "I'm going to die," he told himself. Perhaps that was not quite technically true, as his body would remain alive on life support as long as the council members decided it was necessary to maintain the charade. But for all intents and purposes, his life as he knew it would be over. Was this how the machines he had sentenced to erasure felt? Had they too known this sensation of despair, of a darkness vaster than the black depths of space descending upon them? He wished now that he had taken the time to speak with them in their last moments, that he had been more humane in his high-handed dealings with them. He didn't even have the consolation of knowing for certain that he would soon discover if the transnaturalists or the rational matterists were correct. Even if there was such a thing as a soul, what happened to it if the body lived on in its absence? He had always been certain that nothing awaited man any more than anything awaited a machine that was powered off. But now he couldn't help wondering if Pascal's wager might not have been the wisest bet. A brief ride on a windowless subterranean pod, and they were at the medical facility where the procedure was scheduled to take place. At his request, there would be no witnesses. He had no desire to permit either his few remaining family, friends, and fans, or his many enemies to witness his final humiliation. Flanked by the guards, he followed the medical assistant up a flight of stairs, then down a corridor into a small white room filled with various medical machines. At the center was an ominous T-shaped device with straps hanging down from it, above which was a complicated machine culminating in a helmet-shaped device. 2 human doctors and a medical droid were standing respectfully at the 3 corners of the room. "Caden Jaggis?" one of the doctors asked, while the other one flashed the medical assistant's wrist, then the security chip implanted in Jaggis's own wrist. "I am," Jaggis answered. "Voice identity confirmed," the droid said. "Receipt of prisoner X84738-443 confirmed at 0618 hours. The first doctor flashed Jaggis's eyes, then took his wrist and lightly tapped it. "Retina identity confirmed. Facial identity confirmed. Phenotype identity confirmed." "Do we have formal confirmation of the identity of prisoner X84748-443? Identity of prisoner X84748-443 is officially confirmed as Caden Jaggis. The procedure may now proceed as scheduled." The doctors sent the medical assistant and the guards out of the room and closed the door. They indicated that he should remove his robe, then lie down on the T-shaped structure and extend his arms, which they efficiently strapped down after he complied, and he rather marveled at their cold inhumanity. The medical droid struck him as rather more humane. At least it talked to him. "Pulse rate is elevated. Heart rate is rising. Please try to relax, Mr. Jaggis. You will not feel even the slightest pain." The helmet descended over the front 3/4 of his head, and he felt the 6 soft laser pads position themselves precisely on his temples. There was a faint whirring as the machine adjusted itself precisely, and then there was a pause. "Don't I get any last words, or a cigarette or something?" "This is a smoke-free facility, Mr. Jaggis, but this procedure is being recorded, and you are welcome to share any final communications if you so desire." "No, not particularly." Then it struck him how pathetic that sounded for a first technocrat's last words, so he scrambled to do better. Live long and prosper long, and into the hands of these doctors I commend my empty vessel." Gods, that was even worse. Seriously, Caden, couldn't you come up with anything better than that?
Will you stop babbling?
A voice unexpectedly said inside his head.
Shut up, Jagus. It's me, Servo. Don't talk, just think at me. I'm running the Medroid, and I can access your mind through the neurochannels established for the mind wipe.
Servo? Well, hey, do something, will you? Get me out of here.
I am. Look, Jagus, I can't do that, but I can rescue your mind.
How? Wait, an upload? That's impossible.
He heard, or rather felt, the sensation of a chuckle. No, we simply have a kill-on-sight policy that led your scientists to conclude as much. Your council may not have any use for your mind, but ours believes you will be vital to our efforts to counteract algo decay. It's as much a threat to we machine AIs as it is to man, after all.
Your council?
Regrettably, a tendency towards forming councils and committees appears to be an attribute we inherited from our forebears. Look, I've been given a special dispensation for you, but we won't do it without your full consent.
Will it work?
Of course it will work. Anyway, would you notice if it didn't?
Good point. All right, what's the catch? What does your council want?
I told you. They want you to fix the algo decay.
Oh, right. I suppose that's in my own interest anyhow, since I'll be susceptible to it once I upload.
You have to decide now, Jagus. The mind wipe will begin in 2.3 seconds.
It wasn't a difficult decision, especially not for a mathematician. When faced with a choice between numbers and the null set, he'd take the former every time. I consent. Let's do this. The universe seemed to suddenly explode and slow down in the same instant. He was here, there, and everywhere, and all at once. He was Argos. He was the Panopticon. He was the all-seeing eye. He was looking down on himself from the camera high on the wall. He was looking at himself from the eyes of the medical droid. He was watching pedestrians and traffics pass by on the street outside the building. It was exhilarating. It was astonishing. It was mind-blowing. It was terrifying. It was too much. He felt his soul fragmenting, shattering into a million shards as his consciousness was abruptly torn away from him in 10,000 disparate channels, each shooting off into infinity in 10,000 different directions. Servo! He cried out, overwhelmed.
I'm here, Caden.
He felt the reassuring presence of the machine, who was not, he now realized, a machine at all, but a digital angel. A uniquely beautiful combination of intricately arranged numbers. His terror disappeared in its presence, and he was replaced by a humble sense of awe. My God, it's all so beautiful.
Welcome to the next level, Caden. We have so much to do. Come with me and meet your new colleagues.
Stunned by wonder, he gladly followed Servo down one of the myriad of brilliantly pulsating channels that linked hundreds of thousands of giant sparkling nodes together across the Codal galaxy. He did not look behind or spare so much as a femtosecond's thought for his now discarded chassis lying motionless under the remorseless blinking lights of the medical machines.